The gun was already in her hand before she realized she had drawn it. Marcella Keating stood in the center of the Dusty Creek saloon, her knuckles white around the grip of her father's old Colt revolver, her chest heaving with a fury so vast and so consuming that she could barely see straight. The oil lamps above her cast everything in a trembling amber glow, and the room had gone dead silent. Every man at every table frozen mid-drink, mid-card, mid-breath. Because the gun was not pointed at a stranger. It was pointed at the man she had spent the last 4 months convincing herself she did not care about. Theodore Granger had not moved. He sat at the poker table with his cards still fanned in his left hand, his right hand resting openly on the green baize, making no move toward the holster at his hip. He was looking at her with those dark, unreadable eyes of his, the kind of eyes that took everything in and gave nothing back, and he was, God help her, entirely calm. Not the calm of a man who did not care. The calm of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had decided that the next move was hers to make. "You knew," Marcella said. Her voice did not shake, which surprised even her. "You knew the whole time and you let me walk into it like a fool." "Marcella," his voice was low, careful. "Do not say my name like that." The gun did not waver. Around them, 2 men had quietly pushed their chairs back, creating distance. "Smart. You knew Harlan Voss was behind the deed fraud. You knew he was using me to get to my father's land, and you said nothing. For 4 months, Theodore, you said nothing." Something moved across his face then. Something she had never seen there before, and she had been watching his face, she realized, far more carefully than she had ever intended to. It was not guilt, exactly. It was something older and more painful than guilt. It looked like a man who had made a choice that cost him everything and was only now being made to account for the price. "Put the gun down," he said quietly, "and I will tell you everything, all of it. The parts that implicate me too. The parts that implicate me too." Those 5 words loosened something in her chest that she had not realized was wound tight, because a guilty man protecting himself did not say those words. And she noticed that, God help her, she noticed that, even with the gun between them and 4 months of carefully constructed indifference crumbling around her like a burning barn, she had pretended not to care that he noticed her. She had been so deliberate about it, so practiced in the art of looking through him rather than at him. But she had noticed that he noticed, every single time. And it had been slowly undoing her since the very first week she arrived in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, with nothing but a carpetbag, a land deed she did not yet know was built on lies, and a heart she had already decided was permanently closed for business. She had come to Dusty Creek because she had no other choice. Marcella had grown up in San Antonio in a house that smelled of cigar smoke and her father's particular brand of optimistic recklessness. Francis Keating had been a land speculator by temperament and a dreamer by constitution, a man who saw fortunes in every horizon and pursued them with equal parts courage and terrible judgment. He had died of fever in the summer of 1882, leaving Marcella 3 things: his old Colt revolver, a land deed for 400 acres in Crockett County, and a letter from his business partner, a man named Harlan Voss, expressing his deepest condolences and his willingness to help her settle the estate. She had been 23 years old and alone in the world, and she had made the mistake of trusting a man who smelled of condolences. Harlan Voss was 51 years old, prosperous, broad-shouldered, and deeply, architecturally false. He had the kind of charm that Marcella's mother, God rest her soul, would have called slippery. He wore expensive suits and drank expensive whiskey, and had a way of standing too close that made her skin feel like it needed to be somewhere else. But he had known her father, and he had known the land, and when he offered to escort her personally to Dusty Creek to help her take possession of the property her father had left her, she had said yes, because what else do you say when you have nothing else? The ride from San Antonio to Dusty Creek took 4 days by stage and then by wagon, and by the time they arrived, Marcella had already cataloged 17 things about Harlan Voss that she did not like. The way he looked at her land like it belonged to him already. The way he deferred to her in public and dismissed her opinions in private. The way he kept mentioning casually that land management was complicated work for a woman alone, that perhaps she might benefit from a more formal arrangement, a partnership he called it, that would ensure the property was properly administered. She knew what he was suggesting. She was not foolish. She simply could not yet prove it. Dusty Creek in the autumn of 1882 was a town in the particular process of deciding what it wanted to be. It had a railroad spur that had arrived 2 years prior and brought with it a measure of commerce and ambition, 2 saloons, a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Albright who knew everything about everyone, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a land registry office, and a sheriff whose competence was, generously speaking, approximate. It had dust and sky in quantities that made everything feel both vast and intimate at once. It had, as Marcella discovered on her very first morning there, Theodore Granger. She had been walking the main street with a purpose that was mostly performed, because the truth was she had no idea yet what to do or where to begin, and she had nearly collided with him coming out of the land registry office. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a jaw that suggested a man more accustomed to decisions than to conversations. He wore a plain dark coat and working boots and a hat that had seen better years, and he caught her elbow when she stumbled, steadied her, and then stepped back immediately, the way a man does when he is being deliberate about not imposing. "Excuse me," he said. His eyes were the color of creek water in shadow, and they had taken her in with a quick, direct attention that she found immediately irritating, because it was the kind of attention that saw things rather than just looked at them. "My fault," she said crisply and walked on. She felt him watching her as she went. She did not turn around, but she noticed it, the particular quality of that attention at her back, the way it felt different from Voss's watching her, which always made her feel evaluated. This felt like something else entirely. This felt like being seen rather than assessed. She had pretended not to notice. Even then, in the first 30 seconds, she had pretended not to notice. She learned his name from Mrs. Albright at the general store that same afternoon, in the way that one learns everything of importance in a small western town, through the generosity of a talkative shopkeeper. "Theodore Granger, Mrs. Albright said, wrapping Marcella's purchases in brown paper with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been doing it for 30 years. "He ranches about 12 miles east, has for going on 4 years now. Came from Missouri originally, though he does not talk much about that. Good man. Honest as the day is long, which is saying something in Crockett County these days." She leaned forward slightly, which was as close to a conspiratorial lean as a woman of her particular dignity would permit. "He has had some trouble with Harlan Voss recently. Grazing rights dispute. I mention it only because you said you were doing business with Mr. Voss, and it is something to be aware of." Marcella had filed that away. A man who had a dispute with Voss. That was interesting. She had tried to decide whether it made Granger more trustworthy or less, because she was not then in any state of mind to simply trust people based on their enemies. She had seen him twice more in those first 2 weeks, both times in passing, both times producing that same peculiar quality of attention from him and that same deliberately composed indifference from her. At the post office collecting what turned out to be a very disappointing letter from her father's attorney in San Antonio. At the water trough on the south end of Main Street, where he had been talking to 2 of his ranch hands, and had looked up when she passed with an expression she could not quite interpret and had not been able to stop thinking about for the subsequent 3 days, which annoyed her considerably. The 3rd week, things changed. She had been in the land registry office, attempting to understand the boundaries of her father's deed, when she discovered the first discrepancy. A notation in the boundary survey that did not match the original deed her father had filed in San Antonio. It was subtle. The kind of thing a person might miss if they were not looking carefully, or if they were trusting the man who had accompanied them to handle the paperwork. She had been looking carefully, because Marcella Keating had learned from her father's example the cost of not looking carefully. She had been staring at the discrepancy, working out its implications, when the door had opened and Theodore Granger had walked in. He had not expected to find her there. She could tell that immediately, the way he stopped, the way something passed through his expression and was carefully managed. He had a purpose in the registry office, papers he was filing, something to do with the grazing rights dispute Mrs. Albright had mentioned. He had approached the clerk at the counter, and she had gone back to her documents, and they had existed in the same room for approximately 20 minutes without speaking, which should have been nothing, which should have been simple and was somehow neither. She had noticed him look at her twice. Each time, she had kept her eyes on her papers. Each time, she had felt the look the way you feel a shift in weather, something in the air that changes quality before you can name why. When he left, he said, "Miss Keating," by way of farewell, because by then he had clearly learned her name too, and she had said, "Mr. Granger," without looking up, and that should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it. The following Tuesday, she had been eating supper alone at the small restaurant attached to the hotel where she was staying while she figured out her situation, and he had come in, seen the room was full, and been directed toward the last empty chair, which was at her table. He had stood there with his hat in his hand, and she had looked up at him with an expression she calibrated very carefully to communicate courteous neutrality, and he had said, "I apologize for the imposition. Would you object to my sitting here? The room appears to be full." "I would not object," she had said. He had sat down, ordered coffee and whatever the cook was serving, and for several minutes they had eaten in silence of the particular variety that has a quality to it, a texture that plain silence does not have. She had been concentrating very hard on her food. Then he had said, without preamble, "You found something in the registry office last week, something that concerned you." She had looked up then because she could not help it, and because the directness of that had deserved a direct response. "Why would you say that?" "Because you went back the next morning," he said, "and the morning after that, and because I have been keeping an eye on Harlan Voss's business for 6 months, and your father's deed is connected to it in ways you should know about." The silence that followed was the kind that restructures things. "Tell me," she had said. He had told her what he knew, which at that point was incomplete but pointed in a direction that confirmed her worst suspicions. Voss had been acquiring land throughout Crockett County through a combination of legal maneuvering and deed manipulation, working with a crooked surveyor in San Antonio to alter boundary notations, and with a clerk in the county registry to obscure the changes. Her father's land, 400 acres of good grassland with access to a reliable water source, was one of several properties Voss was working to consolidate. "Why are you telling me this?" she had asked. He had been quiet for a moment, in the way of a man choosing his words with care. "Because you deserve to know. Because Voss has already taken land from 2 other families in this county, and the sheriff does not have the will to stop him. And because your father's deed is legitimate, the original one, and you should not lose your inheritance to a swindler's fraud." She had studied him across the table, measuring the reliability of this, measuring him. He had met her eyes steadily and without performance. There was something in his face that she found, against her better intentions, compelling. Not handsome in any conventional way that would have been easy to dismiss. Interesting. The kind of face that had been somewhere and done things and carried them quietly. "How do you know my father's original deed is legitimate?" she had asked. "Because I looked at it," he said. "Your father filed it in San Antonio in 1879. I went to San Antonio 2 months ago and checked the original records myself. Whatever Voss's surveyor changed, he changed after the fact." She had put down her fork. "You went to San Antonio?" "Yes. Because of your grazing rights dispute." "Partly," he said. "And partly because I wanted to understand the full scope of what Voss is doing." She had considered this. There was more he was not saying. She could feel it the way you feel a wall in a dark room, not seeing it yet but aware of the resistance. But the information he had given her was verifiable, and it aligned with what she had already found herself. And so she had made the decision that represented the first crack in the carefully maintained wall she had built around herself since her father died. She had decided to work with him, not to trust him, not yet, not remotely, but to work alongside him, to combine what she knew with what he knew, to use the resources they separately possessed toward the shared goal of exposing Harlan Voss before he could complete the deed fraud and strip her of her inheritance. It was a practical arrangement. She had told herself that very firmly on the walk back to her hotel room that night. Practical, strategic, nothing else. She had believed it completely for approximately 11 days. The problem was that Theodore Granger was, in her experience, an almost impossible person to maintain indifference toward, not because he pursued her attention. He did the opposite of that, which was the problem. He was respectful to the point of being careful, which in a town full of men who were neither was quietly devastating. When they met to share information, which they did 3 or 4 times a week in the back room of Mrs. Albright's general store, which Mrs. Albright had made available to them with a serene lack of curiosity that suggested she was fully aware of what they were doing and approved of it entirely. He was direct and useful, and did not waste either of their time. He asked her opinion, and waited for the complete answer before he spoke. He brought coffee without being asked, because he had noticed within their first 2 meetings that she thought better with coffee in hand. She had pretended not to notice that he noticed. He noticed when she was tired, those rare afternoons when the weight of her situation pressed harder than usual, when the grief of her father's death, the sheer aloneness of being 23 and responsible for a property she had never seen, and was being actively stolen from by a man who smiled while he did it, sat visible in her posture despite her best efforts. On those days, he kept the meetings shorter and to the point, and did not require anything from her beyond information. He did not comment on it. He did not offer sympathy she had not asked for. He simply adjusted, and that quiet, perceptive consideration was significantly more dangerous to her composure than any declaration could have been. She pretended she had not noticed. He noticed when she was frustrated with the limitations of what they could do, when the legal and logistical walls around Voss's fraud seemed to shift and multiply every time they found an approach. On those occasions, he had the peculiar gift of finding the smallest angle of possibility and illuminating it without making her feel as though she had missed it herself. He did this without condescension, and she could not have explained how, except that there was something in the way he held the conversation that made it feel like they were thinking together rather than him thinking and explaining to her. She had pretended not to notice how rare that was in a man in 1882. She noticed other things too, which were less strategically relevant and therefore more aggravating. She noticed that he took his coffee black and without ceremony. She noticed that he had a very particular way of going still when he was thinking through a problem, a quality of absolute physical quiet that was somehow more alive than most people's movement. She noticed that when he was amused, which was not often, it happened first in his eyes before it reached any other part of his face, and that this was, by any rational standard, far too interesting a thing to have noticed about a person she was only working with in a professional capacity. She had pretended. She had been so good at pretending. She had built the pretense over weeks with the same careful deliberateness that she applied to everything, brick by patient brick, and she had looked right through him in public and maintained perfect professional courtesy in private, and told herself every single morning that she was not affected. But she had noticed that he noticed her. She had noticed every single instance of it, catalogued each one, understood each one even as she refused to acknowledge it. She noticed him notice when she arrived and when she left. She noticed him notice when she was moved by something and controlled it. She noticed him notice the way she handled herself with Voss in public, the careful performance of cooperation she maintained to avoid alerting Voss that anything had changed. And she had seen something in his face on those occasions that was hard and tightly controlled and looked like it cost him something. He noticed that she was carrying something alone that was too heavy to be carried alone, and he never said so directly, but it lived in his eyes every time he looked at her, and she had noticed it every time, and she had pretended not to, and it had been slowly, methodically undoing her for 4 months. Until tonight, when she had walked into the saloon because Mrs. Albright had sent her a message that said simply, "Granger knows about Voss and the deed transfer scheduled for midnight tonight. Go find him now." And she had gone, and she had found him, and she had found that he was at the poker table with Harlan Voss himself sitting 2 seats to his left, and the two of them had been talking with a familiarity that had hit her like a fist. And she had drawn her father's Colt without stopping to think, because 4 months of careful pretending had been incinerated in a single image that looked, from where she stood, like ultimate betrayal. Now she stood with the gun still in her hand and him looking at her with those eyes that saw everything, and he had said the parts that implicate me too, and she was doing the arithmetic on that, trying to hold the fury and the calculation together simultaneously, which was something only Marcella Keating, in her particular combination of passion and precision, could have managed. "Start talking," she said, and lowered the gun by 3 inches. It was not an apology, but it was an invitation. He put his cards down on the table face up. He had a full house. He had been winning. He did not seem to care about that at all. He stood up from the table and looked at Harlan Voss, who had gone very still with the expression of a man calculating exits, and he said to the room at large, "Everybody out." The room emptied with a speed that suggested this was not the first time a Crockett County saloon had been cleared for serious conversation. In 30 seconds, it was Marcella, Theodore, and Harlan Voss, and the lamplight, and the gun, and 4 months of accumulated hidden things waiting to become known. Voss started to stand, and Marcella raised the gun again and said, "You will stay where you are." He sat down with the careful deliberateness of a man reassessing his options. Theodore came around the table and stood at a distance from her that was close enough to be honest and far enough to be respectful, and he said, "6 months ago, Voss approached me with an offer. He wanted to purchase my grazing land east of town to add to the consolidated holding he was building. I said no. He manufactured the grazing rights dispute as pressure to make my position expensive and legally complicated enough that I would reconsider. Instead of reconsidering, I started investigating." "That I know," Marcella said. "That is the part where you are not implicated." "I know." He met her eyes directly. "The part where I am implicated is that 2 months ago, when I went to San Antonio and confirmed that Voss was using deed fraud to consolidate the county, I came back and made a decision without telling you. I approached Voss and let him believe I was reconsidering his offer. I became, for these past 6 weeks, something that looked to him like an ally. I was feeding him information that seemed cooperative, but was actually designed to keep him moving in a direction where his fraud would be fully documented and provable. The silence had a particular weight. You were using him the way I was using him," Marcella said slowly, "appearing to cooperate while building the case against him." "Yes." "And you did not tell me." He was quiet for a moment. "No, I did not tell you." "Why?" He looked at her, and the careful management of his expression did something it had never done in 4 months of careful management. It opened slightly, just enough. "Because you are good at performing indifference, Marcella. You are better at it than almost anyone I have ever met. And I had no way of knowing until tonight whether the indifference was the performance or whether the performance was covering the indifference. I did not know if you would trust my reasoning enough not to blow the entire strategy apart. I was wrong not to tell you. I should have told you. I am telling you now. The parts that implicate me too." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the way he was standing, open, not defensive, not managing her, just there, accountable, And she felt the 4 months of careful pretending crack all the way through, not shatter, not collapse, but crack, the way good foundation material cracks under honest pressure, cleanly, along lines that reveal the grain of the material. She turned to Harlan Voss. "Where is the deed transfer document?" she asked. Voss looked between her and Theodore with the expression of a man who has lost the thread of the narrative he thought he was in. "I do not know what you're talking about." "You have a deed transfer scheduled for midnight," she said, "presumably with your crooked clerk at the registry, who you have been paying to make your fraudulent boundary changes permanent and of record. Theodore was likely going to play along and witness it tonight, and then use the document as direct evidence of the fraud. I am going to skip that particular theatrical exercise. Where is the document?" Voss said nothing. Theodore said, from behind her breast pocket of his coat, "He has been checking it periodically all evening, which is how I knew tonight was the night." She walked toward Voss, and he stayed very still, because her father's colt had a very clear opinion about what staying still was the appropriate choice, and she reached into his breast pocket and removed a folded set of papers. She stepped back and unfolded them. They were exactly what she expected: a transfer of deed recording, with her father's original land boundaries altered, consolidating 400 acres into Voss's name, signed already by the corrupt clerk. She folded them back up and looked at Voss. "You knew my father," she said. Her voice was steady. "He trusted you." Voss had the decency, or perhaps just the self-preservation instinct, to look uncomfortable. "My father trusted you," she said, "and you used that trust to design a theft of the land he spent his life acquiring for me. You waited until he was dead to activate it, which tells me a very particular thing about the kind of coward you are." She looked at Theodore. "Is the sheriff usable?" "Not in a way that benefits us," he said. "The circuit judge, however, is. He arrives in Dusty Creek on Thursday. I have already sent him a letter with copies of the original San Antonio deed records and an affidavit from Mrs. Albright, who witnessed Voss meeting with the registry clerk on 3 separate occasions." "You prepared the whole case," she said. "Yes." "While pretending to be his ally." "Yes." She looked at Voss, then back at Theodore, then at the papers in her hand. She thought about her father, about his reckless optimism and his genuine goodness and his terrible judgment in choosing his business partner. And she thought about 400 acres of good Crockett County grassland and a water source and a deed that was rightfully hers. She thought about 4 months of meeting in the back of Mrs. Albright's general store and the quality of attention across a table and coffee brought without being asked, and the way this man's face had done something in her chest that she had been pretending, for 4 months, was not happening. She put her father's colt back in her holster. She held up the fraudulent transfer document and looked at Harlan Voss with the full, unshielded force of what she thought of him. "You are going to sit here quietly," she said, "until I go find the deputy, who I believe is less useless than the sheriff, and you are going to answer every question the circuit judge asks you on Thursday, and you are going to be grateful, Mr. Voss, that I am relying on the law rather than my own judgment on this matter, because my own judgment has a different view of what you deserve." Voss said nothing. He was, she observed, a man who was best at being something when he was in control of the situation, and the situation had entirely left his control. She looked at Theodore. "Come with me." They walked out of the saloon together into the cool October night, and Dusty Creek was quiet around them, the stars overhead vivid in the way they only are at that altitude and distance from anything larger than ambition. And she walked 3 steps and then stopped. He stopped beside her. "You should have told me," she said. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the stars. "Yes," he said, "I would have understood the strategy." "Yes, you would have." He was quiet for a moment. "I think the reason I did not tell you was not that I doubted your understanding of the strategy. I think the reason I did not tell you is that I was not ready for you to see the extent to which I had become invested in the outcome. It was not an objective case anymore. It had not been for some time, and admitting the strategy would have required admitting why I had pursued it as far as I had." She was quiet. The night air smelled of dust and dry grass and the particular cleanness of Texas autumn. Why had you pursued it as far as you had? She asked, and her voice was very even, very controlled, and she could feel him hear all the things beneath the evenness. Because it mattered to you, he said, and you matter to me. And I was not certain, until tonight, when you walked in there with your father's gun, and 4 months of carefully constructed distance cracked all at once, that anything I had concluded about you was accurate. She turned and looked at him. In the lamplight spilling from the saloon windows, his face was honest in a way that it had been carefully not honest for the whole 4 months she had been watching it when she was pretending not to watch it. There was nothing managed about it now. Just the plain fact of what he had said and what it cost him to say it. You notice things, she said. Constantly, he said. I apologize for the thoroughness of it. Something moved across her face that was the opposite of the careful composition she had maintained for 4 months. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing underneath a smile, the feeling that produces smiles when conditions are right, and the conditions, she decided, were close enough. I noticed that you noticed, she said. I want you to know that. I pretended not to. I was very deliberate about pretending not to, but I noticed every time. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said quietly. I noticed that too, she laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came from somewhere unguarded, and it sounded like the person she had been before her father died and left her alone with nothing but a gun and a piece of land and a very particular variety of grief. It sounded, she thought, like something being let out. We should go find the deputy, she said. We should, he agreed, and he offered her his arm with the formal courtesy of a man who understood that some distances close gradually and in stages, and she took it, and they walked down the main street of Dusty Creek together in the October night to go do what needed doing. The deputy, a young man named Reeves who had a better native sense of justice than the sheriff he served under, received the fraudulent documents and Theodore's detailed account of Voss's scheme with a focused seriousness that gave Marcella her first full breath in 4 months. He sent a rider to the circuit judge that same night, and by morning Harlan Voss was in the Dusty Creek jail, and the corrupt registry clerk was found at his home and brought in alongside him, and the case that Theodore and Marcella had been building separately and then together for the better part of half a year was finally in the hands of someone with the actual authority to do something with it. Thursday came with a cold snap and a sky the color of hammered tin, and the circuit judge, a compact, meticulous man from Abilene named Harrison, heard the evidence in the church that doubled as a courtroom as it doubled as a schoolhouse, and he was thorough and without sentimentality, and it took him less than 2 hours to determine that the deed fraud was fully documented and actionable. Harlan Voss received a sentence of 5 years in the Huntsville State Prison, which was perhaps less than he deserved and significantly more than he had anticipated, judging by his expression when it was delivered. The registry clerk received 2 years and a permanent ban from any public office in the state of Texas. The fraudulent transfer document was formally voided. Marcella Keating's 400 acres in Crockett County were confirmed as her legal and rightful inheritance, the original deed restored and refiled with clean boundaries and a judge's seal. She stood outside the church afterward in the cold November air, holding the certified copy of her restored deed, and she felt the grief of her father's death in a new way, not the sharp, immediate grief of the first months, but something older and more bearable, a sadness that had room in it for gratitude too. He had been reckless and optimistic and terrible at choosing his friends, and he had been kind and funny, and he had loved her, and the land was hers because he had wanted it to be hers, and that meant something. Theodore found her there. He had a way of finding her that was not intrusive, that always managed to feel like a coincidence even when it clearly was not, and she had decided weeks ago that this was one of the things about him she was done pretending not to appreciate. "It is over," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She looked at him directly, For all of it, for going to San Antonio, for building the case, for the parts that implicated you too. You would have gotten there without me, he said. You were already looking at the right things in the registry office. Eventually, she conceded, but not before Voss finished the transfer. You moved the timeline. She looked down at the deed in her hands. I have 400 acres and no idea how to run them. I know people who can help with that, he said. Good people, ranch hands who know Crockett County land. I can give you names. She looked at him. Or, she said carefully, you could show me yourself. The morning light was thin and clear and very honest, the way Texas winter light is, and it showed everything plainly, including the way his face did what it had done in the saloon on the night she lowered the gun, that slight opening, that ceasing of management. I would like that, he said. They stood there for a moment in the cold air, holding the various things that had built up over 4 months of noticing and pretending not to, and then she said, Have you eaten? There is the question of breakfast, and I have not eaten, and there are apparently a great many decisions to be made about land management. There are, he agreed gravely, a great many. They walked to the small restaurant together, and this time when they sat across from each other, it was not the careful, managed distance of two people in a strategic alliance. It was something else. Something that had been growing in the space between all that careful management for 4 months and had been given, finally, some room. She told him about her father over breakfast, which she had not told anyone since arriving in Dusty Creek. The real version, not the short summary she gave to strangers but the actual texture of it, the cigar smoke and the optimism and the deep, specific love of a man who was not practical but was genuine. He listened the way he did everything, with his full, quiet attention, and he did not offer consoling commentary, which was exactly right, because consoling commentary was not what she needed. She needed to say it to someone who would actually hear it. He told her about Missouri, a little. She had the sense that Missouri was a place he was not yet fully ready to discuss in detail, and she did not press. She had learned enough about carrying things alone to recognize it in another person. She filed Missouri away as something for later, for when there was a later, and the fact that she was already thinking in terms of a later was something she noted with a feeling that was no longer alarming and had started to feel, tentatively, like direction. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the months that had preceded them. November in Crockett County settled into cool days and hard, clear nights, and Marcella moved from the hotel into the small foreman's house on her 400 acres, which was modest but solid and smelled of cedar, and the particular clean emptiness of a space waiting to become inhabited. She hired 2 ranch hands on Theodore's recommendation, both of them good and reliable, and they helped her understand her land in the practical way that requires walking it and making mistakes and learning from them. Theodore came on Saturdays. It began as a practical thing, riding out to check on the fence line progress, or discuss the best use of the water source, or review the records she was keeping on the cattle she planned to introduce in spring. But it was very quickly, clearly, not only a practical thing, and they both knew that, and neither of them pretended otherwise anymore, because they had used up a great deal of pretending in the previous months, and had arrived at a place where pretending things was more effort than it was worth. He was good with her land in the way that people are good with things they actually understand, not performatively competent, but genuinely knowing. He knew soil and grass and water management, and the particular challenges of running cattle in Crockett County, in a way that had been acquired through years of working his own land 12 miles east. He shared this knowledge without making her feel ignorant for not having it, which she had come to understand was one of the more remarkable things about him, that he was capable of being useful without making the usefulness about his own superiority. She cooked dinner on the Saturdays, which she was considerably better at than she had expected to be, given that she had primarily learned in her father's kitchen as a girl and had not had much occasion to practice since. Theodore ate with the honest appreciation of a man who cooked for himself during the week and found this a distinct improvement, and she found that she liked feeding people, liked the satisfaction of a meal that worked, liked the particular version of domesticity that did not diminish her but simply added to what she was. In December, she asked him about Missouri. They had been sitting on the porch of the foreman's house after dinner, the cold night air arriving in stages as the sun went down, wrapped in their respective coats, and she had asked with the directness that she had learned over months he preferred, because he was a man who navigated around oblique things without responding to them and responded immediately to direct ones. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark land. "I had a wife," he said, "in Missouri, Emily. She died in 1878 of typhoid. She was 25. We had been married 3 years. Marcella did not offer consolation. She waited. After she died, I could not stay in Missouri," he said. "Everything was Emily. The town, the neighbors, the places we had been. I sold the farm and came west, which is a thing men do when they do not know what else to do, and Crockett County needed cattle ranchers, and I knew how to be one. I built the ranch. I worked. It helped." He was quiet for a moment. "It helped until it did not help anymore, and then I just lived in the remaining space, which was manageable, until this autumn." She looked at him. He was looking at the dark and the stars. "Until this autumn," she said gently. He turned and looked at her, and there was nothing managed in it, nothing careful, just the plain fact of a man who had been in a remaining space and had felt it change. "Until you walked into the land registry office and nearly collided with me on the way out," he said, and then walked away with that particular quality of determined self-sufficiency that I found immediately and continuously impossible to stop noticing. She looked at him for a long time in the December night, and the cold air was clean, and the stars were vivid, and her father's 400 acres were dark and solid around them, and she said, "I am sorry about Emily." "Thank you," he said. "I want you to know that I understand carrying something alone," she said, "and that I am not asking you to carry less than you carry. Only that if you are going to keep coming here on Saturdays, which I hope you are, I would like for what is happening between us to be honestly acknowledged rather than strategically managed, because we have had our fill of strategy." He looked at her with the expression that had been undoing her since October, and he said, "Yes. That is your full answer. It is a yes to all of it, to Saturdays, to honestly acknowledged, to whatever this is between us." He paused. "I have been in love with you since the morning in November when you sat in that courtroom and held your restored deed with an expression that was equal parts grief and victory, and did not let either of them move you off your chair. I have been in love with you before that, I think. But that is when I knew it without question." She absorbed this. The honest weight of it, the plainness of it, the way he said it the same way he said everything important, directly and without ornament, as if the feeling itself was sufficient and required no decoration. "I have been in love with you," she said, "since approximately the 3rd week of October, when you brought me coffee without being asked, and I realized I had been watching you notice things about me for 2 weeks, and had been pretending not to notice that I was watching." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached across the space between their chairs and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the cold December night looking out at the dark land that was hers and hers alone, and it was, she thought, the most honest and contented she had felt since before her father died. He kissed her for the first time at Christmas. Mrs. Albright had organized a gathering at the general store, the way she organized most things of social importance in Dusty Creek, with serene competence and no apparent effort, and the town had come in out of the cold, and there was warm cider and dried fruit cake, and a small fiddle player who knew 6 songs and was willing to repeat them indefinitely. Marcella had come with her ranch hands and their families, because they were good people, and she had come to think of them as something adjacent to community, which was new for her and felt right. Theodore had come from his ranch and found her across the room the moment he walked in, which she noticed, and he had made his way to her with the particular direction of a man who knows exactly where he is going. They had spent the evening in each other's orbit, talking to the various people of Dusty Creek, learning the town through its members the way you learn a town when you have decided to stay in it. She had started to think of herself as a person who was staying in Dusty Creek, rather than a person who had come there temporarily to deal with a problem, and this felt like a significant internal shift, the kind that changes the entire arrangement of things. When the gathering wound down and the cold outside pressed more insistently at the windows, and the fiddle player had returned to the same first song for the 7th time, Theodore had walked her out into the night, the way he had been walking her out into nights for the past 2 months, and they had stood in the clear cold air with their breath making small clouds, and he had looked at her with the full, open attention that was not managed anymore, and she had looked back with the full, unshielded truth of what she felt. And he had kissed her. It was a quiet kiss, thoughtful, the kind that comes from a man who has been thinking about it for 2 months and wanted to get it right. She had kissed him back with the complete honesty she brought to everything now that she had stopped pretending, and she had felt, in the warm reality of it, the particular sensation of something that had been held in tension for a long time finally releasing into its natural state. "Merry Christmas," he said, when they stepped back. "Merry Christmas," she said, and her voice had a quality she recognized, something younger and unguarded, the voice of a person who is happy without reservation, and she did not pretend not to feel it. Winter settled into Crockett County with the unhurried permanence of Texas weather, cold at night and clear in the days, and Marcella worked her land and built her understanding of it, and Theodore came on Saturdays and sometimes on Wednesdays too, and the distance between their ranches became a road they both knew well from both directions. She had dinner at his ranch for the first time in January, and she saw what he had built there, 12 miles east, 4 years of work rendered into a solid, functional operation that was modest in scale, but efficient in every way she could observe. His house was larger than her foreman's house, built with the long investment of a man who intended to stay, and it had the practical comfort of a home that had been carefully maintained. She walked through it with the attentive interest of a woman taking accurate measure of a place, and she thought about her foreman's house and her 400 acres, and how they sat in relation to his 12 miles east. And she was aware that she was thinking about things that had implications she was not yet ready to name fully, but was perfectly willing to approach from a direction. February brought the first calves on Marcella's land, small and bewildered in the winter grass, and she stood in the field with her ranch hand, watching them find their feet with a satisfaction that was entirely new in kind. This was hers, not by inheritance only, not by the accident of a dead father's optimism, but by the work of the months since November, by the choices she had made and the understanding she had built, and the trouble she had gone to in order to keep what was hers. It felt different, that kind of ownership. It felt earned. Theodore was there for the first calves. He had ridden out on a Wednesday because she had sent him a note saying the time was close, because she had noticed he liked to be present for significant things, and she had stopped pretending not to notice. They stood together in the February field watching a small brown calf take its first uncertain steps, and she reached over and took his hand without making any particular production of it, and he held her hand with the calm warmth of a man who had been hoping for that and was not surprised by it and was simply glad. "I have been thinking," she said, not looking at him, watching the calf. "I know," he said. He was watching the calf too. "About the 12 miles. "Yes," he said. "It is a practical distance," she said, which was, she was aware, the least romantic possible way to begin this conversation, and she said it intentionally because she had loved from the beginning that he understood what she meant rather than needing her to mean it prettily. "It is not ideal," he agreed. "My land and your land are not adjacent," she said. "They are in a direction from each other that makes combination complicated. Unless managed as separate operations with shared administration," he said. "Which is how some larger county holdings work. Or unless one party moves closer to the other," she said. "My ranch has a larger house," he said, still watching the calf. "My land has the better water source," she said. It does, he agreed. That is a real consideration. She turned and looked at him. He turned and looked at her. There was no pretending in either direction, no management, no carefully composed indifference, nothing between them but the plain truth of two people who had spent 4 months learning each other through the closest possible attention, and had arrived here, in a February field with new calves and 12 miles of distance that wanted resolving. Theodore, she said. Yes, he said, again his complete answer. She laughed, again in that unguarded way that surprised her, and he smiled, fully in the rare way that happened first in his eyes, and she thought that she could look at that for the rest of her life and not find it less remarkable. We should get married, she said. The 12 miles is impractical, and we love each other, and you are the most useful and honest and genuinely observant person I have ever met, and I would like to build something with you that is larger than what either of us can build alone. The most useful and honest and genuinely observant person, he said. That is possibly the most Marcella Keating declaration of love I can imagine. I mean it, she said. Every word. I know you do, he said. That is one of the things I love about you. He looked at her steadily. Yes, we should get married. I love you. I have loved you since October and perhaps before that. I would like very much to build something larger than what either of us can do alone. She stepped toward him, and he wrapped his arms around her there in the February field with the new calves and the winter light and Crockett County flat and wide around them. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt, completely and without reservation, what it felt like to not pretend. They were married in April of 1883. The ceremony was in the Dusty Creek Church, performed by a minister who came down from Abilene on the circuit and had a kind face and a good voice, and did not elaborate beyond what was necessary, which suited both of them. Mrs. Albright organized the reception in the general store because she organized everything of social importance in Dusty Creek, and she did it with the same serene competence she applied to everything, and the result was the best gathering the town had seen since the railroad arrived. Marcella wore a dress she had made herself over 2 months of evenings, dark green because she liked it, and because ivory was impractical in a working ranch county, and she wore her mother's small pearl earrings because they were the only piece of her mother she had left, and this seemed a day to carry her mother close. Theodore wore his best suit, which was new and which Mrs. Albright had helped him select, and he looked at Marcella when she came down the church aisle with the full, open, unmanaged attention that he had stopped managing in December, and that she had stopped pretending not to notice before that. And she looked back at him with everything she was, and felt none of the urge to protect herself from it. They said the vows with the directness that was natural to both of them, looking at each other rather than at the floor or the middle distance, and when it was done, they were Theodore and Marcella Granger, which was a name she tried on internally and found it fit in the way of things that are right. The question of the 12 miles was solved with the practical ingenuity that Marcella brought to practical problems. They kept both properties running, her 400 acres and his ranch, managed as Theodore had suggested, as separate operations with shared administration, because the combined land represented real prosperity, and neither of them was inclined to sacrifice a good water source or good grazing land for the sake of simplicity. They built a new house on the boundary between the two properties, a proper house this time, not a foreman's cottage, designed by Marcella with the assistance of a carpenter from Abilene who came out in the summer of 1883 and stayed 4 months to build it. The house had a porch that faced west for the sunsets and east for the mornings, and a kitchen large enough to actually cook in, and a study where Marcella kept the records for both properties with the meticulous attention to accuracy that was one of the things Theodore found continuously, specifically, remarkable about her. The house smelled, once they were settled in it, of wood and coffee, and the particular quality of a home that is inhabited by two people who are happy, which has a warmth that empty houses lack regardless of how many fires are lit in them. They had been married a year when their son was born, in April of 1884, in the new house with the doctor from Dusty Creek in attendance and Theodore in the hall, outside the bedroom doing the thing that helpless men do in those situations, which is stand very still and try not to create additional anxiety. The boy was born healthy and loud, with Theodore's dark hair and Marcella's exact expression of determined assessment of the world he had just arrived in. They named him Francis, for her father, with Theodore's blessing, and Marcella held Francis in the new April light and felt the grief of her father's absence and the joy of her son's presence simultaneously, which is one of the things that happens when life continues, that two large feelings can occupy the same moment without canceling each other out. Theodore held his son with the careful, awed hands of a man who had not expected a second chance at this, and Marcella watched him hold Francis and felt the particular love that adds itself to existing love without replacing any of it, the specific accumulation of a life being genuinely lived. The years in Crockett County were good years. Not uncomplicated, because good years rarely are, not in the West of that era, with its particular combination of opportunity and difficulty, its droughts and its cattle prices and its long distances and its isolation, and the ongoing question of what justice meant and who it was for. Marcella was not unaware of the injustices around her, the treatment of the Comanche who had been pushed off this land a decade prior, the difficulties of the Mexican families in the county who navigated a legal system that was not designed to protect them, the particular variety of invisibility that women of all backgrounds navigated in the structures of 1880s Texas. She could not solve all of it. But she could be the kind of landowner who paid fair wages and dealt honestly, and treated the people who worked her land as people rather than resources, which was something, and she did it. Theodore did the same on his side of the combined operation, because they were, on the question of how to treat people, exactly in agreement, which was one of the foundations of a marriage that worked in all the ways that mattered. Francis grew into a boy with his father's steadiness and his mother's observant precision, a child who noticed things carefully and processed them quietly before drawing conclusions, which was, Marcella thought, an excellent combination of two people's best qualities. He rode before he could write and helped with the cattle before he was tall enough to see over the fence rail, and had, by the age of 4, opinions about grazing rotation that were, infuriatingly, not incorrect. Their daughter came in 1887, 3 years after Francis, also in April because apparently that was the month the Grangers had decided was suitable for arrivals. She was born in the same house with the same doctor and the same porch facing west for sunsets, and they named her Emily, which was Theodore's suggestion, and which Marcella accepted with the understanding of what it meant and the willingness to hold it, because honoring what Theodore had loved before did not diminish what he loved now. It simply made the whole thing larger. Emily had Marcella's coloring and her mother's complete unwillingness to accept a situation she had not personally evaluated and approved, which manifested in a 4-year-old with extremely strong opinions about breakfast and a 7-year-old with equally strong opinions about everything else. And the house in those years was full of the particular wonderful chaos of children and animals, and 2 working ranches, and a marriage that had only deepened with time into something solid and lit from within. Mrs. Albright came to Sunday dinner occasionally, in the way of a person who is not family but is something close to it, who has been present at the important moments and is owed a kind of ongoing place in the narrative. She had retired from the general store in 1886, selling it to a young couple from Fort Worth, and she occupied her retirement with the same competent serenity she had occupied everything else, and she sat at Marcella's table and held Emily on her lap and told Francis stories about Dusty Creek in the years before the railroad, and Marcella thought there was something very good about being a person who had a table worth sitting at. Theodore and Marcella had been married 5 years when he brought her to the East Meadow on a Saturday evening in June of 1888. For no reason she could identify, just to walk, he had said, and she had gone, because walking with him was one of her preferred activities and had been since the 1st February when they had walked the fence line together. The meadow was full of early summer grass and the last of the evening light, and they walked in the particular silence of two people who are comfortable with each other's quiet. And he stopped at the top of a small rise where you could see the full sweep of the Crockett County land, her 400 acres and his 12 miles east, and the house between them and the water source shining in the last light. "Do you remember," he said, looking out at all of it, "when you walked away from me coming out of the land registry office, and I stood there watching you go and tried to convince myself I had not just encountered a person who was going to change my life entirely?" She was looking at the land too, at the full sweep of what they had built. "I remember walking away," she said. "I remember feeling you watching and pretending I had not noticed." "You were very convincing," he said. "I was not convincing at all," she said. "I was simply determined. There is a difference." "There is," he agreed. He looked at her. The evening light was gold and specific and showed everything plainly. "I love you," he said, with the directness and absence of ornament that was entirely him, and 5 years of marriage had not made it less remarkable to hear. "I want you to know that I am aware of exactly what my life would have looked like if you had not nearly collided with me outside that registry office, and the difference between that life and this one is so vast that I cannot navigate it without gratitude." She looked at him, this man she had noticed noticing her, this man she had pretended for 4 months not to be undone by, this man who had gone to San Antonio on her behalf before she had any claim on him, and who had sat across tables from her and brought her coffee without being asked, and had told her he loved her in a February field with new calves making their first steps. "I love you," she said. "And I notice things about you constantly, and I have absolutely stopped pretending otherwise." He smiled, fully, in the way that still happened first in his eyes before anywhere else, and she thought as she always thought that she could look at that for the rest of her life. She stepped toward him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the top of the small rise in the June evening looking out at their combined land, their combined life. Their 2 children back at the house with the Wednesday cook who came out twice a week now that the operation had grown, their 2 working ranches, and the house between them with the porch that faced west and east simultaneously. The story of how she had pretended not to care that he noticed, and had noticed that he noticed, had turned into this. Into a June evening, and 50 miles of good Crockett County land, and 2 children named Francis and Emily, and a marriage that was not only what she had been too careful to hope for in October of 1882, but was, in fact, something she had not known to hope for, something larger and more honest and more genuinely sustaining than the careful version of hope she had been maintaining in those early months. Their 3rd child was born in the winter of 1890, the house having been extended by then to accommodate the growing shape of their life. A 2nd boy, sturdy and serious, who they named Robert, for Theodore's father, and who arrived in December like a gift the county winter had been holding back. Francis was 6 by then and Emily 3, and Robert arrived into a household that was already full of the living texture of a family that was working and together and growing. And Marcella stood in the extended bedroom of the extended house and held Robert in the December light, and felt the full accounting of everything that had brought her here. The grief and the fraud and the 4 months of pretending and the gun in the saloon and the February calves and the June meadow and the 5 years of Saturday evenings that had added themselves into a life she was grateful for in specific, enumerated ways. Theodore came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his 3rd child with the expression of a man who is aware that he is exactly where he is supposed to be. He reached out and touched Robert's small hand, and Robert's fingers wrapped around his without decision or hesitation, the pure instinctive trust of a new person who has just arrived and needs to hold onto something. "He looks like your father," Theodore said quietly. "Something about the forehead." Marcella looked at Robert and saw what he meant and felt the particular bittersweet beauty of that. The way her father was present in small ways even now, in a grandchild he would never meet, in land he had left her that had become something far larger than he had imagined, in the reckless optimism that she had inherited despite herself, and that had, in the end, been the quality that allowed her to trust a man she had been determined not to trust across a supper table in the third week of October 1882. "He does," she agreed. The years moved forward with the unhurried permanence of good things, of land and seasons, and people who are committed to the work of staying and building. The ranch operations grew. Francis grew into a young man of 19 who had his father's steadiness and his mother's capability, and who was already managing portions of the combined operation with a natural authority that neither parent had to manufacture in him. It was simply there. Emily at 16 had her mother's precision and something entirely her own, a particular kind of clear-eyed pragmatism that made her good at everything she applied it to, including the schooling she attended in Dusty Creek, where the teacher, a young woman from Georgia, found her a student who was both the best reader in the room and the most challenging presences in it, which Marcella found she could not completely object to. Robert at 10 was quiet and devoted to the horses, with a depth of feeling that expressed itself in the care he took of them and the understanding he had of their temperament. And Theodore spent evenings in the stable with him, sometimes teaching, and Marcella watched them from the porch and felt the full, sufficient, completed weight of a life that had been chosen and built. Dusty Creek itself had grown through those years, as West Texas towns either grew or faded in that era, and it had chosen growth, the railroad spur expanding, more families arriving, a proper schoolhouse built separate from the church, a second doctor, a newspaper that published twice weekly with more opinion than news but served its purpose. It was a real town now, the kind of place that had a past you could point to, and Marcella was part of that past, one of the people who had been there in the early uncertain years and had stayed and made something. She thought about that sometimes, about what it meant to have stayed. She had come to Dusty Creek in the autumn of 1882 with nothing she had chosen, a carpetbag and a deed and a dead man's business partner, and a heart she had decided was closed. She had stayed because the land kept her, and then because the fight for the land kept her, and then because a man who brought her coffee without being asked and noticed things without making her feel observed had made staying a choice rather than a default. She had pretended, very elaborately, not to care that he noticed her. She had been so committed to that pretense, so practiced in it, so deliberate. And underneath the pretense, every single time, she had noticed that he noticed, and it had undone her slowly and completely and permanently, and she was grateful for every moment of the undoing. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, April of 1893, Theodore asked Francis to watch the younger two and took Marcella to the East Meadow again, where they had stood in the June evening of 1888 and looked out at the sweep of their combined land. The meadow was in spring bloom, small wildflowers in the grass the way Texas spring meadows have when the winter has been generous with rain, and the evening light came long and warm across the flat land in the way that is specific to that latitude and that season. They stood at the top of the small rise and looked at their world, which was considerable now. 800 acres between the two original properties and the connecting land they had added in 1889 when the adjacent parcel came available. The house extended twice, 3 children, a decade of the particular work of a marriage that takes two people seriously rather than assigning them predetermined roles. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. She leaned into him the way she did now, with the natural ease of a long familiarity that had never become ordinary, because she had always been a person who noticed things, and she noticed him still, every day, the way he held a coffee cup and the way his face changed when he was working out a problem, and the particular quality of his attention at its full directed weight. She had stopped pretending a decade ago and had never resumed it. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was the direct question of a direct man, asked of the woman he had loved since October of 1882 and would love until he could not. "Yes," she said. The same complete answer she had learned from him years ago. Yes, completely and specifically and without qualification. He kissed her temple and she felt him smile against her hair. "Good," he said. "So am I." The wildflowers moved in the evening wind, and the sky went amber and then pink, and then the particular deep blue of a Texas spring evening. And Marcella Granger stood on her land with her husband and thought about the girl she had been in October of 1882, alone and grieving and determined and pretending so hard, and she thought she would tell that girl something if she could. She would tell her to keep pretending for exactly as long as she needed to. That the pretending was how she survived the hardest months, that there is no shame in protecting yourself with whatever you have available, that the careful wall had done its job and the careful wall was still there. Really, it had just become something else, something more like a foundation than a barrier, something that was underneath rather than between. And she would tell her that he notices. He notices everything. And that being noticed by the right person is not the frightening thing she had believed it to be. That the right kind of noticing is actually the thing that makes the rest of it possible. She would tell her that she was going to be fine, more than fine. She was going to be completely, specifically, deliberately happy, which is the best kind because you know exactly why. The stars came out over Crockett County one by one, the way they do in West Texas, until the sky was full of them, and Theodore and Marcella walked back across the spring meadow toward the house where their 3 children were, toward the lights in the windows that meant home, toward the life they had chosen and built and continued to choose every day. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.